So this is going to be an interesting one, because this is going to be all the destroyer guns. All the destroyer guns. And to be honest, I've stretched it a bit, because some of the guns were used by sloops, had been used earlier on by destroyers. Some of the guns were sort of used by flag class corvettes and things. So basically, I used a gun. I've gone for as many of the guns as I could that were used in 1920s and 30s and 40s that served in World War II that fit this parameter. And there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them. And again, have I gone into everyone's fleets? Well, I've gone to the Americans, the Italians, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, and the British. And the Swedish. So that covers pretty much everyone who's producing guns at this point. Pretty much everyone who's producing guns at this point. So yes, this is going to be quite a lot of slides. What do I mean by quite a lot of slides? Well, it's about 14 slides, 14 different sets of guns. Now, the thing is, that's not the number of guns, though. Because some of those slides have a single gun fit in this caliber. Some of these slides have multiple guns fit in this caliber. And none of these slides have a table of comparisons between all these guns. None of them do. And there's a reason I didn't do that. Because, honestly, that's very low-hanging fruit for me to do. Copy, paste, slide from NavWeps, put all together next to each other and go, look at this! And I could have gone that route, but I decided what I wanted to make this video about, and I hope you're going to indulge me and enjoy it, or find it interesting, is why they were picking the guns they were. You see, no Navy is looking at the gun stats of all different gun options and going, oh, this one's the best one stats, so I'll pick that. Most of the navies involved are, to an extent, to a lesser or greater extent, involved in development of the weapons they're picking for their ships. And they are developing specific characteristics into those weapons to fit the way they feel destroyers are going to be fighting, those ships are going to be fighting. And so, realistically, doing a comparison like that, with all the table, all the gun stats next to each other, is great for top trumps, but it doesn't tell you anything about why different navies were choosing the guns, were developing the guns the way they were. And so this video is going to be about that. This video is about the development of guns, why navies were going for the specific guns they were, why they wanted the batteries they did. And I hope you're going to enjoy this. But as said, no big table. Someday, if you'd like a video of a big table in doing the top trumps, I can occasionally be persuaded to do a top trumps video. It's not usually my style, but occasionally I throw them in because people like them, I understand, and I enjoy them as well to an extent. I just don't find it particularly illuminating when I'm looking at them. It just tells me which gun's the best gun, and which, if I was arming the Albanian Navy, I should probably avoid that gun. Not necessarily what I want to do with, or why I would like that gun for the ship I'm designing. So let's start off with the 3.9-inch guns of the Japanese, the smallest in this category. Now, originally this design started out as a 70 cal, but that went through too quickly even for what the Japanese wanted to do with it. The 65 cal was slightly better, but let's be honest, despite this being possibly the best AA gun of the Japanese Navy in World War II, it was also possibly the worst gun to try and keep going, and it had a maximum rate of fire of 15 to 19 rounds per minute. It is a capable system. It is a capable system. And before you start quoting to me the theoretical of 20 to 21 rounds a minute, in multiple sources I have read the same thing was found post-war by everyone looking at them, that the hoists couldn't supply them faster than 19 rounds a minute, and that's if they were lucky and the hoists were working properly. 15 was the normal. So the gun theoretically has a breech mechanism which can fire more quickly. They just can't sustain it. They just can't sustain it. And as a vessel, as a capable weapon system, they were good. They were good for AA work. They really were good for AA work. Their date of design was 1937. The date of in-service was 1942. And yes, it was intended to be a replacement for the 4.7-inch or 120mm gun used on various escort vessels. But realistically, they have 101-ish guns used on ships, and they have 68 used on land mountings, and all these mountings, especially all the ones on lands, were twin mountings. It's just, it's a capable weapon system, and it shows what the Japanese could have produced. But realistically, this was date design as 1937 and entry date 1942. This needed to be in service well before 41, and it needed to be fitted a lot more widely. But the thing is, this gun, as good as it is at air defense, is really not what you want for surface engagements and dealing with other destroyers. It is useful as a task force escort. It is useful when you are starting to realize that air defense is becoming your priority for your escorts and for your fleet. It is not so useful when you're looking for a general purpose weapon. And it's one of those things which comes in at time. When you're trying to look for a dual purpose weapon, which is what you realistically need for destroyers, you're often faced with an argument of, should we go for something which is more AA capable or more anti-surface capable? In this case, this is a very good AA weapon. Not so good anti-surface. If you're dealing with other destroyers, if you're dealing with anything bigger, you're not going to be able to do enough damage quickly enough to help you. Now, that can mean you can go, well, we've got torpedoes. You have got torpedoes, yes, and they are useful. But the thing about torpedoes is that they either work and they hit the target, or they don't. There's no in-between. With guns, you can have an in-between. They can be damaging the target enough that it's not able to fight back. They can inflict a mission kill. Torpedoes, they're either going to kill it as far as the operation scenario is concerned, or they're going to miss it completely. In which case, you're still dealing with it. Realistically, therefore, when the Japanese do a hard turn into this weapon system, it's because they realize that their air defense is suffering and they've got weaknesses. And considering how well developed their air attack profile was, how well developed their airstrike capabilities were, this is actually a big shortcoming on their part. It is a big shortcoming on their part. If you think about it, there are other navies which have issues at the point. The US Navy has the excellent 5-inch 38 coming through, and there's a reason why they stick with that for as long as they do, because it's good. We're talking about that in this discussion. The Royal Navy have a problem in that the false positives of exercises, but had defined a lot of things up to the early 1930s, until you have the first rear admiral aircraft carriers, Admiral Henderson, become third Sea Lord and turn around and go, yeah, those false positives, I believe them about as much as I believe that the moon is made of cheese. I'm not sure if he actually used that line, but he did say at various other points it was a favoured line of his, according to some reports. I believe it as much as the moon's made of cheese. So it does seem appropriate for him to say that. And that's what leads to development of the 4.5-inch gun, which I've done an alternate history video on the development of, if it had come in earlier. And it is fitted earlier. It's just not fitted to destroyers earlier, but we'll talk that when we get to that on this video. This weapon system is actually surprisingly good, though, for what the Japanese need from it. Realistically, as a secondary, this should probably have been on pretty much every one of their cruisers and every one of their capital ships. It should have been the number one priority for fitting and creating, because it provided them with that much of an improved firepower against aircraft. For destroyers, it's a great thing for escorting, and it's a great thing for smaller escorts. But for destroyers, it doesn't have enough punch. It doesn't have enough. This is going to penetrate armor. This is going to penetrate steel. This is going to penetrate and give me a capability against an opponent. But it is an excellent AA gun and can be fired pretty much vertically straight up if they want to. The elevation of the twin turrets, the mount would be -10 to +90. That's almost unheard of. That's 100 degrees of vertical traverse, pretty much. It's just, it's a wonderful thing, but it's... I got -150 to +150. So they've got a 300 degrees of movement. Again, it's not the best, but it's not the worst. And they've got this great elevation and depression. It's a really good AA mount. I cannot stress this more. It's a really, really good AA mount. And for the point they're producing it, when they're realizing the issues with their air defense, it makes a lot of sense. But considering their plan for war was usually based around an attrition of enemy forces, and attriting their destroyers was going to be part of that, it's not got a punch. It's not got a punch. And yes, most destroyers are unarmored. They really are. But they're also the fastest maneuvering vessels you're going to face. And yes, you're carrying 8 of these on this ship. And that's going to give it a very capable broadside. It's, it's a tribal class destroyer in that equivalent in terms of number of guns and firepower coverage. But the thing is, a tribals is 8 4.7s, which have a very similar rate of fire, and yet when they hit you, you are going to feel it a lot more. Square cube law is a cruel, cruel mistress. That being said, we're now into the 4-inch guns, and yes, I kid you not, the Royal Navy has roughly, during World War II, 7 different types of 4-inch guns in British service alone, and because you can sometimes find 1 or 2 of them fitted to ships at random, and a lot of random destroyers around, technically they're all in service. Technically! Which is, as always, the best type of correct. Now, again, this one you might be seeing, well, Alex actually does more than 7 there. There are more than 7 there, but some of them are approved versions of the earlier ones, so... yeah, we have the Mark 4s, 12s, and 22s, which are 4-inch 40s, broadly speaking the same barrel, but it's modified as things go on and their mechanisms changed. And you can go up and down the rest as well, and it's a similar scenario. When we're talking about AA weapons, we're usually talking about the 4-inch 45s. That's usually what we're talking about in terms of British purpose. But brilliantly speaking, the Royal Navy has a big problem. They are building a lot of ships, and they are keeping a lot of older ships going, and they never throw anything away. I mean, the Royal Navy is the Navy which turns up to World War II and people go, oh, are we going to have enough guns? And they go, they're sort of looking around and go, we're just going to the warehouses. But we need to build more guns. We're just going to the warehouses. Why are you going to the warehouses? You walk in and it's... so you guys never sell anything, do you? Why would we? Do you scrap it? Why would we? Does this stuff even still work? Probably. We'll find out when we use it. It is a disturbing organization. One of the basic facets you find when you start putting this all together is you're going... their main thing is everything's got to have a gun. I'm not really sure whether that gun's going to be appropriate for the task or not. Mostly they were okay. But everything's got to have a gun. That's the basic thing. Everything has to have a gun, and we're going to have a gun for everything. And they do. You see, the US Navy is what the Royal Navy is often compared to, but the US Navy has an unfair advantage. They are literally churning out 5-inch 38s and churning out ships at an ungodly rate. The Royal Navy is just activating ships at an ungodly rate from reserve, mostly. and weapon systems from reserve because of the various things the British government has done in the interwar period to their infrastructure. And it's a good job they did, because if you look at a large chunk of the Royal Navy in World War II, if we start looking at some of the ships and what they're being armed with, well, they aren't starting to break through into the new entry versions of the 4-inch gun till 1942. The XIX, i.e. the Mark 19, is of course what's fitted to things like the River-class frigates. Don't worry. The Flower class, well, as said, they had the Marks 9 and 10, which was slightly higher velocity. They wanted to go for a lower velocity gun for the frigates. They felt it better suited their operations and what they were being required to do. And this is the thing. What are these guns for? They are usually being designed, in the case of a 4-inch gun, as a single-purpose gun with a general-purpose secondary capability. So they are either an anti-surface weapon, or they are an anti-aircraft weapon, with a secondary capability in that other role. They are either one or the other. They are a focused weaponry. They aren't a true dual-purpose weapon, but they don't need to be. They're being designed mostly in the early 1920s and even during World War I. For example, the Mark 9 gun, well, that was the Mark 5, the barrel from the Mark 5 quick-firing 4-inch, which isn't listed here because that version isn't in use in World War II, fitted with the breech mechanism from the Mark 8, and is introduced in 1917. The Royal Navy produced roughly 2,400 of these guns. 2,400. And by World War II, they've still got thousands left. Literally. They have many, many barrels and many, many guns left. So they keep on using them. And it's the same for a lot of these systems. They have these things there. Which makes them, broadly speaking, a very useful gun to have around. But it is, sometimes when people talk about it, they're looking and going, why are the British using the 4-inch guns so much? And the answer is, because they have them. And they'll do the job, and so they can put it into service right now. It's a great feeling when you go, well, we could produce this weapon system. You could. We could. And that's a 90% solution. It is? That's good. Or we have this thing sitting on the shelf, which is an 80% solution if we put it in this modification. How long to get the first one? About a year to 2 years. How long to get the second one? About a couple of weeks. We'll take the second option now. It also takes someone of great courage and conviction to go that route. Because it's always safe to say we developed a new gun to solve this problem and it worked, or if it didn't work, oh, the engineers are wrong. But if you're implementing an older weapon system and you're using that, it goes wrong, people are just going to say, why did you waste money? Admittedly, at this point, especially post-1937, usually what the Royal Navy ends up doing is implementing both solutions. They start the development process and they implement the 4-inch option, which might explain why there are going to be quite so many small guns on this list from the Royal Navy. Quite so many. And again, I do apologise to the person who once in a conference said to me, but how can you justify for the Royal Navy that they had 3 different gun types below 6 inches that in use? And I looked at them and I just started laughing. I thought they must have been making a joke. But they thought it was 4-inch, 4.7-inch, and 4.5-inch. Of course, they do have some 3-inch guns wandering around. They have, but none of them fitted destroyers, so not in this video. They have 4-inch multiple marks. They have 4.5-inch multiple marks. They have 4.7-inch multiple marks and types. They have 5-inch guns. They have 5.25-inch guns, and they have 5.5-inch guns wandering around. in World War II and at various other points. The reality is the Royal Navy had gone through many, many attempts to standardize, many, many attempts to design a weapon system which was going to fill their needs and give them the advantage. The closer they get to that is the 4-inch family, honestly, because it's quite so expansive. But realistically, it's not until they get to the 4.5 inch they find a true dual purpose weapon that can be equally good in the AA role and in the anti surface role. So it can be a true dual purpose weapon for their needs and for their criteria. But that's a little bit down the road. Next, we have the US 4-inch guns. Again, these get forgotten so often, but they're really quite cool. Now, here is the point where I would love to say that the 4-inch gun of the American service was just as much loved as the 5-inch 38, and honestly, if war had broken out earlier, it probably would have been, because it's a good gun. But it was neglected. And there is a reason why many of the flush deck destroyers, especially the ones sent to Britain during World War II, were rearmed. Usually with British 4-inch guns. And again, escort carriers, especially ones heading to the British, tended to get rearmed as well. Why? Because, for want of a better phrase, as much as this gun was a good gun in the 1910s, and when it first entered service, because its data design was 1898 for the Mark 7, but Mark 9, Mark 10, 1910, 1914. Mark 10 never entered service. The Mark 9, it just hadn't been really looked after and improved. There's a lot of capability. When you consider, in a similar time period, the 4-inch gun for the Royal Navy, how many different generations it had gone through. And then we have the US. And yes, they have the 7, 8, 9, and 10, but the 10 never entered service, and the 9 is mostly what we're talking about at this point. And that is back in 1914 entry into service. 1914. It's a good gun, but it fires 8 to 9 rounds a minute, and it has issues because it is a World War I weapon system. And it's supposed to be on primary destroyers. It's supposed to be in terms of primary capability. So the poor gun really does suffer. It still has good armor penetration. It can do a full inch at 18,000 yards. It can do 2 inches at roughly at 6,000 yards, and 3 inches of armor penetration at nearly 4,000 yards. A couple hundred yards less than 4,000 yards. So it's a good gun. But in terms of weight and in terms of movement, everything, it just hadn't been looked after. It's one of those things, again, when you're looking at it, we talk about navies in the interwar period, and this comes up quite a lot when talking about gun design, we're talking about things. The top line details of a navy doesn't tell you much about its funding situation. Details below it will tell you what is going on in its funding situation. The Royal Navy has issues with funding. They are curtailed by treaties in terms of their production, but they are still able to work through generations of guns and implement. They are still working through and developing these things. They're still able to fund the development of the research, the things that go on with it. The US Navy is having to make some very hard decisions. Very, very hard decisions. And this is a symptom of that. This is a symptom of this issue. But still, it was a good gun. It's just their 4-inch guns were completely ignored, pretty much. And if you consider how important the flush deck destroyers were still to the US Navy in 1942 and beyond in various secondary roles, that is a sad thing. That is a very sad thing. These guns were going to end up getting used. Going to end up getting used. There are also guns, of course, in use by Argentina in various points. We'll leave that to one side. And then we hop up to the 4.5-inch guns. From the major powers, there isn't really anything much between the 4-inch, and I was looking for a 4.1-inch or a 4.2-inch, and because I remembered there being discussions around guns of that size, but I couldn't find any details of them necessarily. So we've jumped straight to the 4.5-inch gun, and this is Britain's true dual-purpose weapon system. And reason again, I've divided up into Marks 1, 3, and 4 versus Mark 5, is realistically that is a change in these guns. There is a change, but Marks 1, 3, and 4 pretty much use the same barrel. It's in different mounts and different styles. Now, to be fair, there are more 4.5-inch weapons than just this. There are more. There is another one which is fitted to torpedo boats, or rather motor gunboats, and is designed in 1944, but doesn't enter service till 46, so I've not included in this list. Although, the fun fact is of having a 4.5-inch 19 cal. Beautiful little gun. Beautiful little gun. Exactly what you want for your motor gunboats. To really scare the bejesus out of things, going, why the frick are they carrying a 4.5-inch gun? In terms of the other 4.5-inch guns we have mentioned here, well, we're talking about the Marks 1, 3, and 4 that eventually become the Marks 2, 3, 4, and 5 when they move from Roman numerals. These are the weapons which the Royal Navy has coming into service and is designing in roughly the mid-1930s. Now, why do I say roughly the mid-1930s? Because there is a debate. There is a debate. Now, officially, we would date it to 1935, and we'd say in service 1938. Unofficially, you can push it back to 1934. Realistically, the 4.5-inch gun is pushed forward by Admiral Henderson, and is one of the things he's working on putting in as a dual-purpose system. But there are problems with getting the mount up to the standard. It's one of those really interesting things. They get the gun and the breech mechanism up to the standard, but getting the mount up to the standard, they need to replace the 4.7-inch in terms of the role for ships is the problem. It's the weight of the gun and the weight of the mount, and it's what it's going to bring into its capability. It becomes an excellent weapon system, The earlier twin mountings were talking 12 rounds per minute per gun, so that's 24 rounds per minute. The later destroyer twin mountings are between 15 and 20 rounds a minute, and you can quite literally be doing something which is firing therefore 40 rounds, and that's per gun again, so the mount could be firing 40 rounds per minute. And it's a very useful, very capable system. And it is a true dual-purpose system. And that was what they were importantly developing. Now, the thing is, there is a lot of research work which goes into these guns. And they spend a lot of time on large ships being developed before they're put on destroyers. Because on ships, you've got space to use them in the form they are being provided. And one of the problems with fitting them to destroyers is that it was decided they needed to have separate ammunition, not combined. And the reason they wanted the separate system is that when they used the fixed ammunition on destroyers, it made them too weighty to use in rough conditions, even on cruisers. On the Scilla and Charybdis, it was too weighty. There was even problems on Ark Royal. So the idea very quickly came, okay, we've got to use separate ammunition. There were time taken to develop that, and that's one of the reasons why these guns aren't implemented more widely after 1938. They take a time till about the mid-1940s, mid of World War II, 1942. It does feel like the mid-1940s at that point, but lead up to one side, for them to be actually more widely implemented in other ships. And it's up until 1944 that the 4.7-inch is really still the dominant destroyer weapon, mainly because of its rate of ammunition load and its ammunition capabilities and how quickly you can utilize that weaponry. But it is an interesting thing to get into, that if they had developed separate ammunition, earlier on, if they'd pushed it through as more of a priority, if they had got a slightly better mountain service. Again, I've done alternate history on this, so I leave you to go see that video should you wish. I think it's come out not long before this video does, in terms of its timeline, in August 2025. There are options to push it through. There are options to push it through. Now, the Mark V gun, well, that shouldn't, in theory, be mentioned here, because its official in-service date is 1947. Its date design is 1944. However, the first prototype was installed on HMS Saints. HMS Saints. And she's a battle class destroyer. And realistically, that gets it just about over the line to be worth mentioning it. But that is really, the Mark V gun is the Royal Navy pushing for something which can do a designed rate of fire of 24 rounds per minute, which it can do full power. But at most of its service, it's limited to 12 to 14 rounds per minute when it is firing, because, well, that preserves barrel life quite dramatically, with a burst round of 18 rounds per minute. And again, both those systems are done by hand rather than power. The power-assisted firing really does up the capability of the gun. It really does. The humans in them, well, let's be honest, a human tires, and there's also only so much space you can get in a turret. And if you have a look at the rather nice HMS Vampire up there with the Mark V turrets, yeah, those are good. Those are good guns. It was a really interesting weapon system to have for a few years, and gave the Royal Navy for many, many years, the twin Mark V 4.5-inch gun, a truly superb weapon system for its period. It is a sad thing we haven't continued on the history of the dual mount. It could be a really interesting thing to have kept going, but there are reasons for and against in terms of single versus dual. With that being said, we're now on to the 120mm AK 4.7-inch guns of the Swedish construction. Now, you might notice that these are mostly fitted out from Dutch ships, Polish ships, other people other than the Swedes, in terms of the listing here. But that's not quite the case. That's not quite the case. You see, the M20, the 12cm 50/4.7-inch model 1924C is fitted to the Goldberg class. And so all these vessels are fitted to various generations of Swedish destroyers. But I thought it would be more interesting for us to consider how many of them are fitted to others. The Groms, the Dutch Navy is basically buying everything. In this period, quite a lot of the minor powers and the sort of the medium powers were literally, if they didn't have their own armaments industry, Sweden was the option to go to if you wanted to have a full service armaments industry, but you didn't want to align with any of the major camps. They had a neutrality option. You probably aren't going to go buy from the Japanese. The Japanese don't like letting people have enough wandering around their factories for that to be a actual practicality, and that to be a possibility to actually do. Your options of Britain, France, Italy, or America. Well, Italian guns have a reputation for wearing through their barrels rather quickly, so for minor powers that's not really an option. French metallurgy at this point is interesting, and as we'll be getting into, they have a whole cast of guns which are intriguing. The British will sell you anything, but that relies on you staying on the same side as the British if you want to get their spare parts, something they do wield as a weapon. They are quite happy to make you addicted to the British supply, because they know that means that come wartime, that means you're going to be on their side or you're going to be neutral, because you ain't going for them if you're addicted to their supply. The Americans, they're almost as problematic as the British on that front, but they added in a further interesting thing of the Americans can get very mercurial about the supply even in peacetime if they don't agree with what you're doing. The British, as long as you're not actively interfering in British interests, the British don't give a flying hoot. The Americans do actually seem to care. And plus, the Americans aren't really putting that much money into their gun development in the 1920s, so yeah, they're not really a good one to go with. So I suppose you could try and go Soviet, but who really wants to go there? See your left if you're looking for a good dual-purpose weapon, and I do mean a good dual-purpose weapon, that gives you suitable capabilities in terms of AA performance and anti-service performance for your destroyer-like vessels. You're going Swedish. You're going for the Swedish guns. And they're good guns. They're going to look after you. They're going to perform well for you. These are guns which are reliable. So why aren't they used more? Why aren't more powers using them? Well, the main problem with them is their mounts. Even the 1924 gun has a maximum elevation of plus 35 degrees, and it's all manually operated. If we go to the 1934 gun, it's got a maximum elevation of plus 30 degrees. They don't really have weapon systems which are designed for high angle engagement. And this is another factor in how much they obsess and how they focus on designing their 40mm Bofors. But if we leave that to one side, for their 120mm guns, they are looking at something which is primarily an anti-surface weapon. They're primarily something which is going to assist with their ships in operations and dealing with surface threats. The Swedish are always thinking through the likelihood of them ending up in such an engagement. Now, the 1942 model does come in with a twin turret which has a plus 80 to negative 10 degree range of elevation, and that is basically a realization that no, we do need our guns to be engaging, our primary armament to also be engaging air threats. We can't just have them sitting on side providing engagement against surface threats. But you also have to remember, for the Swedish, it did make sense in terms of how they are building their systems, because they are building their systems as a whole system. Okay? You have the 40mm AA for long range, well, for medium-ish, longish medium range engagement of aircraft, and you have these for engagement of surface targets, and you're expecting in the Baltic to probably be doing running fights which are going to be engaging both simultaneously, so you're dividing your firepower. You're making sure your firepower is engaging targets appropriate for it, and you do this by restricting the mounts. At long range, yes, you might want to have this gun involved, but the moment the enemy gets to a range which point the 40mm Bofors can take over, you leave it to the Bofors and you get back to dealing with surface threats, because they are the threat you need to be focusing on. It's a nice idea. It is a nice idea, but it's well worth noticing that during World War II, they immediately turn over, and eventually the 1942 version comes out, and that version is very much a dual-purpose weapon system, and shows again the capability of Sweden to produce such weapons. And now we're into the 4.7-inch guns, and now we get into the theory of British destroyers and why they are armed the way they are. Now, the problem for the Royal Navy, realistically, throughout this period, from the 1920s and 1930s, is that the 4.7-inch gun is good. And why is that a problem? That sounds like it shouldn't be a problem. 4.7-inch gun is good, Alex. That's a great thing. Well, you see, the Royal Navy likes to do melee actions with their destroyers. They want to be able to fight their way through the enemy destroyer line, torpedo their cruisers, torpedo their capital ships, their carriers, everything. They want to do a lot of damage. They want to be able to engage enemy torpedo boats at long range. They want to be able to do reconnaissance and fixing by fire at night. The idea is you fire shells at capital ships, and when they start a nice fire, that's your aiming point you then fire your torpedoes at. So you've got a point to aim your torpedoes at, and that sort of thing. They have lots of uses, and the 4.7-inch gun is a great fit for this. It's got a fairly rapid rate of fire, it's got a fairly accurate, it fairly easy to move around. It's fairly, they've got good range of mounts which allow them to fit in all sorts of things. It's just a good system. It's got separated ammunition, so it's easy and quick to load for manpower and a sort of manual loading, all these things. It is a really, really good gun. Its weakness, if it has one, is that in the mounts that it could do under the weight limits they were able to do under the treaty system, they couldn't really make it into the AA gun it could have been. There is a scenario whereby they develop the 4.7-inch gun, which I'll be talking about next, the other variant of the 4.7-inch, earlier, and they managed to get that into service earlier, but still that comes with issues. That comes with issues of fitting it to ships, of arming ships up with that capability, and what you can use them for, what they can do. Even the Mark 11, which is fitted into this interesting turret you can see on the L&M class, has a maximum elevation of plus 50 degrees. And there are reasons for this. There are reasons for it mainly relating to the treaty systems and the treaty weights and how they're going to manage it on the ships. And honestly, I wish they had broken with the treaty a bit more. If they had gone, let's see what we can do. Let's break the treaty system. Let's maybe go with a 6-gun system, as they did with the L's, anyway, and have only one set of torpedoes like you have on the tribals, and actually put in some proper weight and muscle into those turrets, and they could have had a high angle, low angle system, so it's a true dual purpose system. There are options. But they didn't. They didn't. And the thing is, that's because, at the end of the day, the Royal Navy is looking for a weapon for its mass. What is important is the value of the ships in the aggregate. And the trouble is, they have the testing data. So despite Admiral Henderson getting into position in 1933 as the Third Sea Lord and being in charge of looking into these things, in charge of development, it's roughly 3 years more before he's so ensconced in that position that he's all things to all men, that no one can really just naysay him. And the thing is, there's a lot developed in that time, and there was the results of their testing, whereby, believe it or not, in peacetime exercises, and this is why you always have to worry about exercises as a data source, because you can get false positives. When the pilots couldn't really die, they tended to concentrate on going after carriers, capital ships, and occasionally cruisers. They rarely bothered with the destroyers. So the assumption was made, after they'd done enough exercises and it had happened often enough, that that was what it was going to be like in wartime. And it's only, as I said, after you've had Henderson as Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, and 1930, and now Third Sea Lord in 1933, that someone starts questioning this assumption loudly. And lots of others, when they start looking at it, start questioning, going, hang on, in wartime they're actually going to be getting shot at. Oh, frigate. And people start to realise that the gain, the risk versus reward function in an exercise, means you go for that lovely, crisp capital ship, or aircraft carrier, or maybe a cruiser. Because that's going to be something you can brag about back at home. In wartime, when you actually might die, that destroyer at the edge of the task force starts to look very attractive. They go from being the thing you ignore to the sexiest thing you've ever seen. That's it. It's a risk versus reward strategy. And it's one of those things of we often talk about in history, the problems of not doing enough exercises, of not having enough information, not having enough data, not having been able to test things enough, etc. You can talk about various torpedo systems not having. The British, possibly uniquely amongst the nations, suffer from the sheer amount of exercises they do in the 1920s and early 30s, and the false positives they get from them. They suffer from it. This affects their gun development. This affects their mount development specifically, and the guns they're choosing. It's a really weird thing to say, but the thing is, the exercises gave them such confidence that they kept on building their tower. If they'd had less exercises, they might have been a little less confident and a little bit more edgy in their decision making. But they weren't. They'd done plenty of exercises. This is how it worked out every time, so they keep building up their logical tower. It happens to all humans. All humans can be prey to this fun thing, and it's why you have to watch your colleagues. They have a piece of evidence, another piece of evidence which seemingly reinforces it, another piece of evidence which seemingly reinforces that, and so they build up a logical tower, and at no point do they question the evidence that the tower is built on, because that evidence has supported each other. This evidence supports this piece of evidence, and this piece of evidence supports this piece of evidence, and they all support each other. So therefore, this is a logical thing to follow. And no one went, but this is an exercise. This is data from an exercise. Until about 1933, no one really in the Admiralty is asking the question loudly enough, arguing it. There are probably people thinking it. There are. But the trouble is you get groupthink. It's the wonderful thing is when you're talking it through, and usually at this point someone says, battleship admirals to me. And I look at them and go, it's not battleship admirals. It's false positives of exercise information. And the battleship admirals don't give a flying hoot about what the destroyers are armed with. The few admirals who do qualify as battleship-obsessed admirals don't care as long as the destroyers do their job of keeping other destroyers out of the way. So they're taking no notice. The very small minority of admirals who really believe the battleship is the only way, the very tiny minority, and you have them in pretty much all navies, don't give a flying hoot about what the destroyers are armed with. They really don't. And the interesting thing is, most battleship admirals, if you talk to them, and the people who are pretty pro battleships, they're not anti-carrier. They want the carriers as well. Usually, as it is in the Royal Navy and the US Navy, you're pursuing the battleships and the aircraft carriers, because the aircraft carriers, you realise, are the coming weapon system, but they're not here yet. The battleship is the mature weapon system, which very much is here and is capable of killing anything that comes in its path. So, you do both. Because you're dealing with national security and the survival of your nation. You don't go, you know what, I'm going to put all my eggs in this basket because it's coming. It might be here next year, it might be here in the next 10 years, but I'm going to put my eggs in this basket right now. And you don't put all your eggs in this basket and go, well, we're just going to build the battleships because, they're mature capability. No one sensible does that. You do both. And I know someone's going to bring up the Italian Navy, but the reason they didn't was because, A, they were having a minor war with the Regia Aeronautica, which makes some of the IJA relationships look positively pleasant. And B, they have Italy. Their primarily theatre of operations is the Mediterranean, and they have Italy in the middle of it. And they have air bases around there, and other areas as well around the Mediterranean. That's their thought process. We have Italy. We're operating within range of Italy. It's not a sensible thought process, but it's the thought process. We'll be getting onto their guns in a bit. But with the British with a 4.7-inch gun, you've had this weapon which was, yes, better at anti-surface, better at night operations, better all the concepts, but did have an AA capability, and it was considered a suitable AA capability in the mounts it was in. It's not really. It isn't really. And what's worse is, they had high-angle mounts for the 4.7-inch. They did have them. They were mainly fitted for the Mark 13. High-angle Mark 13 mount is the good example I tend to use. And usually they are attached to the Mark 8, Mark 7, and Mark 10 gun. Usually the Mark 7 is the 4.7 4.3. But these are the weapon systems which are fitted to capital ships, historically. Capital ships. They are fitted to Rodney, Nelson. These things were originally fitted in their original period. And they were good weapons, again. Very good weapons. They could do up to plus 90, down to negative 5 degrees. In terms of the high-angle Mark 12 mount. And most of these were single mounts, again, and all these things, but the systems are there. That's the point. The systems are there. They are available. They just weren't pursued. They weren't properly considered. They are also interesting because those high-angle mountings earlier, they had power rammers to allow them to be loaded at higher angles of elevation more easily. Which is a really interesting system again, but it wasn't really pursued because when you're looking for ship-on-ship engagement, you want the double, you want to keep it on, you want the treaty limits, so you want to keep it on, especially from 1930 onwards when they were sort of starting to look and consider these things. From 1930 onwards, you have the London Naval Treaty come in, and you're looking at the system from what can we get the most value out of this ship. And sometimes you make these very small changes because they save a little bit and you think what you're losing doesn't matter. And it's the greatest what if of naval history for the Royal Navy, realistically, in the run-up to World War II, is if they pursued the 4.7 inch, if they'd worked with the various weapon systems which are around, designed for things like Rodney, etc., with their power rammers, and had worked on those to turn them into the destroyer weapon, instead of continuing to evolve based on the Mark I, which had been evolved by this point in the 1930s into the Mark IX and the Mark XII. Now, the Mark XII was what was usually used on the twin mountings and is what's famously used on the tribal class destroyers. And these are, again, really good weapons. They are really good. And I know I keep saying they're good guns like a broken record, but this is the point. And this is one of the things to think about when you're talking about gun procurement and when you're looking at weapon systems today. They're a good weapon system. They seem to be doing well in the exercises requested. They fit your concept of operations as you think of it at this current time. So it becomes very comfortable. You've got multiple variants in roughly 4 standards. You've got, systems which are going to do what you need them to do in your mind. You can get very attracted on it, and then you can find yourself caught out. And that is what happens with this gun. It is the mounts which are caught out. Not the gun, the mounts. And in many ways, they are caught out because of the reaction to the treaty system. The sensible thing might have been to go with a 6-gun arrangement for a tribal class destroyer, but have ones which have power rammers on a Mark 12 barrel. So you have a nice, 45, 4.7 inch 45 with power rammer to assist it, and suddenly you've got a ship which can deal, which is a truly dual-purpose weapons. Suddenly you've got that. But they didn't. They didn't. Which leads us to someone else who was playing around with dual-purpose guns, and also with 4.7 inches. But, yes, the Italians... You have a small war going on between Ansaldo and Otto over who's going to supply the best guns for the Italian Navy. And you'll get this standoff. We're building the 120mm 50. Good. Then so Ansaldo will then build the 1926. And Otto will respond with the 1931, and then try and improve on it in 1933, and then Ansaldo will come in 1936, and so will Otto in 1936, and then Ansaldo comes in 1937, 1940, and yeah. At one point, of course, there is the Vickers-Terrani motto, but look, let's just leave it, and we'll start at the very beginning. We'll start with a Schneider Cannet Armstrong model 1918. So the thing is, the Italians start off with the need to have something which works in the Adriatic. You see, that's the real crux of the matter for them. Dominance of the Mediterranean is one thing that they seek, it's Mare Nostrum. But realistically, the Adriatic is their back garden. It's their home. They're supposed to be safe in it. They're supposed to be dominant in it. And while the Austro-Hungarians are there, they're obviously not. And once the Austro-Hungarians are gone, the other powers in those waters are still too close to be comfortable. Still too close to be comfortable. If the Mediterranean is a lake, well, the Adriatic is a canal. And frankly, you want to put things down quickly, you want to put the things down effectively, and you want to put them down hard so they don't come back again. And that's the criteria which goes into their gun selection. So we've got to start off with the Schneider Cane Armstrong Model 1918. One of those weapons which is just so good. So good. It's one of those pattern weapons which you sort of get, you look into its production and you go, for its time in 1918, this is a sublime weapon system. This is a weapon system we are going to love. It's useful. It works. And that's the basis of their evolution from that point onwards. The next one you have is the Vickers Turney Model 1924. And then the Otto Model 1926. All come from this line. But the Otto Model 120mm 45 leads to Ansaldo responding with the 120mm 50 in 1926. And that sets up a whole new pattern because, you know, that's an even better gun. It's had to rise above a very good gun. It's an even better gun. Even better for the scenario they want. And initially we're talking about 6 to 7 rounds a minute rate of fire per gun. So they're not exactly particularly quick firing. And this is because, well, the breech mechanism adds in a lot of delays. So despite the fact that the 48.5 pounds for the high explosive and 51 pounds for the armor piercing projectiles that they fire is competitive with contemporaneous weapons which have a far faster rate of fire. For example, the tribals were 10 to 12 rounds per minute per gun on their twin mountings and their single mountings, and it's just and similar for the Royal Navy 4.7, and their ammunition is, as said, it's 50 pounds for the high explosive, 50 pounds for the semi armor piercing. It's equivalent to the Italian, actually slightly heavier than the high explosive. It's breech mechanism, it's the way you're carrying out the loading. All these things will affect your time in firing. So normally, when we're talking about rate of fire, we'd be looking at what angles are you firing at, what's the weight of the ammunition you're moving, all these things. In this scenario, it's quite literally the mechanism. It's slowing them down. Now, a good team can achieve a higher rate of fire. They can. But that's a very well trained, very well drilled team. It is not as simple a system as some of the other contemporaries. It provides, though, and this is the reason why the Italians keep with it, 3,000 feet per second in muzzle velocity, which is faster than most other guns, which means if the shell hits, it's going to do a lot of kinetic damage and it's going to have a lot of penetration. So rate of fire loses to penetration. It's an exchange. All these things are compromises, but again, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about fighting in the Mediterranean, which is relatively stable compared to the North Sea, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, some of the areas of the Pacific, etc., that the Royal Navy's looking at fighting in. So they can afford to make that. They can afford to go, well, we're going to not have to worry about similar extremes of weather when the Mediterranean is that extreme, because the Mediterranean is usually very, very nice, and when it's very, very nasty, no one wants to be out in it at all. Because when it's very nasty, it's very, very nasty. It doesn't just go through bad moods, it goes into an absolute, oh, we're in that kind of mood today, okay, everyone's going to port scenario. So what they're looking at is, we don't have to worry about being able to do the rapid rate of fire and keep up a rate of fire when it's very difficult. But we do want to make sure that when we are firing, were going to cause the damage. So they picked the gun that does that. They are developing weapon systems which do that. And most of these weapon systems, and I swear when they have these different dates, they are similarly crafted weapons. They are just slightly improved. They are slightly evolved. It's an interesting thing how they keep them going, and they keep a good arms industry going. This is, again, Italy does have a very strong capabilities when it comes to their defense capabilities. But now we're at the Shameless Book Plug. Shameless Book Plug, where I get to say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow, all those wonderful things you can do down here. And also remember, when you do that, the notifications bell, that's the important thing for content creators. Because it's the amount of people that watch a video in the flick onto the video in the first 5 minutes, the first hour, the first day of it being up, that really are going to see how well it does during the algorithm. And watching it through in the first day really does help. When it's first come out, really does help it work out itself way through on the algorithm. So thank you for people to do that. And those bells matter, because how filled in that bell is, how dark it is, and how filled it is, says how much control you want to have over your choice of the videos versus the algorithm's control. And that matters. Also, you want to have notifications turned on your phone as well. But to be fair, I have it very strictly regulated on my phone. The notifications are for channels linked that come on are usually for channels which are linked to my contact list. I've managed to get the settings to work that way thanks to some gentle manipulation of settings and modifications. The trouble is my contact list now contains a lot of the people who I follow on YouTube and who I subscribe to. So, yes, what started out as a great thing to mean I knew when Drax videos were going live or Jamie Seedale's videos were going live has now become something which goes off on my phone far too often. It was a great idea when it started. But thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for helping it grow. And I hope you're enjoying this video. I know it's not necessarily a traditional look at these guns, but I thought I would do it in my own way and see if it was enjoyable to people. And interesting. And now we are back to, well, Swedish guns again, realistically. Now, with that philosophy in mind, the Dutch really did like the Swedish guns. They really did like what both were building, but they wanted something which was going to better suit them. So they Boffered Boffer. Now, why am I saying that? Bofors, of course, famously takes the pom-pom design, which is in many ways an enlarged Vickers Maxim machine gun, but we'll leave that to one side. Goes through some evolution. And they developed that into the Bofors 40mm, which is ubiquitous. Still going to this day, fitting into the Type 31 class of the Royal Navy today. And they think, so they do that to Bofors. They take the Bofors 120mm design, the 4.7 inch, and they look at it with Wilton Finiod, and they go, how can we make this slightly shorter in barrel length to allow for higher elevations, to allow for better anti-aircraft defense, and more manual control and more stability at long range, to basically be able to support this better from home for various reasons. They want it for the Gerald Callenberg class destroyers, they want it for various sloops, for very minesweepers, This is the Van Kinsberg gun, a sloop. And she's armed with them quite happily. And so this is what the Dutch were doing. They were going, look, we like this design. We wanted to better suit our needs though. They're thinking through the anti-aircraft threats. They're emphasizing that. Again, so you're looking at the Dutch East Indies, which is the area where they're thinking about what can we offer to fleets, what can we offer as a capability for a small size, better anti-aircraft capability, that's a good thing. What can we offer that's going to give us a better defense in the Dutch East Indies? We want something which is going to be a good all-around ship. We want something which is going to be able to defend itself if it's out solo. If it's out going to get ambushed, we need it to be able to survive. This is what they're looking for. And so these are the guns they work on them. They are very good systems. Now, I would say that they are pushing for power loading, they are pushing for triaxial stabilized mountings. They are really trying to work it through. The Mark 9 design mentioned here was only ever going to be designed for the 1938 gunboats and the 1047 battlecruiser. The Mark 7 goes on the William van der Zaan, the Mark 6 on the Van Kinsberg and Gerard Campbell class, and the Mark 8 on subsequent Gerard Campbell class. They are good guns. Their date of design was 37, their date in service was 1939, so they are some of the newest guns in service in World War II. Does that necessarily make them the best? No, but the thing is, they were pretty good, decent weapon systems. But they're just not in enough production, there's not enough of them available for us to really rate them properly. I think myself, I would love to have seen the design for the capital ships, the battle cruisers in service, because A, that meant the battle cruisers were in service, but B, they could have been a really interesting system, being able to go -10 to +80 degrees. They would have really given them a very good anti-aircraft capability. Most of the other mounts are -10 to 55 degrees, or 45 degrees. Which basically means they're falling into the same trap as the British. And this is something which I want to emphasize, because we're just about to get to a gun which is often considered the best gun of World War II destroyers. I'm not so sure. I'd say it's the best gun and mount, on average, when you're comparing it to all the others of World War II. But if you're just comparing gun to gun, not including the capabilities of mount, I think that changes things. And that sometimes gets me into trouble, but bear with me, because as we already discussed here, powered mount, the elevation capability, the speed of elevation, the loading, all these things have an effect on performance. And those are not the gun's characteristics. The gun's characteristics is its barrel and is its ability to be its breech and system. The rest of the stuff built around it is the mount. It's what the mount brings to the table. And so that has an impact. And this is when we're talking about, of course, the 5-inch guns of the US Navy, and the 5-inch 38 especially, because the 5-inch 38 is a great gun and mount combination. The system they produce is absolutely exceptional, but that's the thing. I think if you look at some of the mounts of the 5-inch, especially some of the earlier mounts of the 5-inch, then it doesn't come across as good. It doesn't come across as capable. Once they get into some of their later mounts, they become really, really, really good. And when I say later mounts, I'm not talking too late. I'm really not talking too late. They very quickly get into a very good mount because of the way it gets worked on it, and how you're going to work with twin and single mounts, and how these things are going to work, because the US are looking at it, and they're putting the effort into it once the 5-inch 38 comes into service. I'd also say the advantage the 5-inch 38 has, and it really is an advantage when we consider it, is that it is designed in 32 and in service in 34, just when funding's starting to update. And it comes about because, honestly, the 5-inch 51 has been enough, as far as Congress was concerned, for the previous 16, 20 years. It's pre-World War I. It's a very capable gun, but honestly, it needed to be changed earlier. But the thing is, the US Navy gets very used to the 5-inch system and working with a 5-inch gun, and they want a 5-inch gun. They want a 5-inch gun, but they want something which is going to give them better firepower, better air defense, and the size, the 38, and therefore that shorter barrel makes it far more flexible, lighter barrel, even lighter than the 51 would have been if you cut it down by, well, let's be honest, 13 times 5. So if you'd cut it down by 65 inches, it would still have weighed more than the 5-inch 38's barrel, because of the better metallurgy, the better design standards. These are really good guns. Do not get me wrong, the 5-inch 38 is a really good gun. Just when people say it's the best gun, I'm sitting there going, So we talked about there are other guns which, on their performance characteristics, are better. But the thing is, it's when you put the performance characteristics of the 5-inch 38 in the mount the US Navy puts it in, and then you look at their operational capacities and what operations they are suited for and designed for and how they're used, that's when it becomes the best gun. Because once you put it across all those different components. And I think that's an important thing to remember. When I'm looking at the 5-inch 38 mount, I'm looking at something which is capable of supporting it firing in all angles. The hoist system is designed to resupply it as quickly as possible in a way which means it can be reloaded at all angles. And this gives it a capability. This gives it a really good capability. And it can allow you for rapid firing, it can allow you for rapid loading, which always makes for rapid firing, but also rapid loading means less wear on the crew. If I don't have to stand there holding the shell for a while, if I can quickly pass the shell off, that is better for my energy. Yes, I've got moving, but if you think about it, and I'm going to do a quick demonstration, so bear with me. This is my 20 kilogram exercise vest. It's a nice thing, glide was here. But if I'm doing this, that's quick. But if I'm doing this and holding, that's going to tire me out. Especially if it's... And then it's pick up, and it's hold, put down, pick up, hold, put down. That is a good way to tire someone out. It's a good way to tire everyone out if you think about it. So if you can make loading more quickly, if you can improve the speed of loading, you can reduce the rate at which your crew tire out, which means you get a better, more efficient gun and a more efficient system going on. I really need my emotional support missile or something to make those demonstrations. The trouble is, the floppy torpedo just doesn't look right for it. It really doesn't. It's too small and too light, and everyone knows it's a fluffy torpedo, so it never works for that one. Really, I need something better for demonstrate than my exercise vest. But the 5-inch 38 therefore provides the US Navy with an exceptional weapon system overall once it's coupled in, and this is really an important lesson which comes out of World War II. Because what the US Navy had been looking for was the weapon system overall. They said, we need to fill these criteria. We need to have rapid firing. We need to have a good general purpose weapon that can work against ships, can work against aircraft, can provide us with the level of all-round general purposeness that we need from these guns, from these vessels. And it's the system you're building around it. It's not just the gun. It's also the mount. It's the way your fire control is going to work. It's putting all that together that builds the system. And I'd say that's a really interesting lesson the US Navy takes from World War II, but also what they're including from watching others in the early 1930s and 1920s when they're finally getting some funding to do this. They are going into it with a mind of, okay, right, we've watched the British go through about 3 different times trying to fix this, and the problem with the British, with all their different systems and all their different attempts at putting in different gun types to be that dual-purpose weaponry, was, to be fair, the British were looking at the gun, not the system. That's the British mistake. The person who changes that is, unfortunately, he's in Pan, he's the Third Sea Lord, Admiral Hanson, who comes in 1933, and that's too late. Because by the time the system's built, war has begun. If you consider with the Americans, with their fire control system, all these things, they'd actually started coming a lot earlier. And this gun is designed 1932. It's not started to design because it's designed 1932. Its teething troubles it did have when it entered service in 1934, but by very quickly it was highly reliable, robust, and accurate. And basically, after World War II, what the US Navy does is they just replace the 5-inch 38 with the 5-inch 54. And they upgrade all the different components of the system. And that is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about a system. So basically what I'm saying is 5-inch 38 is a good gun, but it's in a great system, which is what makes it the best all-round gun of World War II, probably, of destroyer level. I'm sorry, when it comes to 6-inch guns, it's going to be the Royal Navy 6-inch gun. That is an absolute beast in performance. But Americans win the 8-inch, but with the 5-inch, with the destroyer guns, if I was just picking a gun, I would probably go for the British 4.5-inch after it gets its separate ammunition, but I'd want the American system supporting it, because the American system will get the best out of the gun that's in good it. And the 5-inch 38 is a great gun. I'd say the 4.5-inch gun has its slight edge on it in terms of anti-shipping. That's where I give it the edge. But the thing is, there's a small edge there. But that's not enough of it, and that small edge doesn't make any difference once you compare the whole system. And that's the American, where the Americans have really introduced something great. Then we have the German 127mm, their 5-inch. Oh, good lord. Well, this gun. Let's talk about it, shall we? Now, these guns are interesting. They start out life as the 105/55, are bored out to become the 127/45, roughly. The 105/55 is a C28, so it's 1928, whereas these are 1934, but there is a difference between them and a 1938 version. The 1938 version is better. They have a theoretical rate of fire of between 15 and 18 rounds per minute, and they can have a theoretically greater rate of fire if they're on land and stable, and the theoretical rate of fire comes with enough codicils that you understand why it was never actually that. The actual phraseology is, this gun shall achieve 15 to 18 rounds per minute in calm conditions with a well-trained crew. 15 to 18 rounds per minute in calm conditions with a well-trained crew. There's also the proviso that, understand the handling as well sometimes phrases up, and it's a fun thing to deal with. It's a phraseology you don't often see around destroyer guns. You either give in and realise that your gun isn't stabilised enough, but you're going for the spray and pray approach. Broadly speaking, that does apply to at least one of the Royal Navy, one of the 4.7-inch mounts of the Royal Navy, and it does apply to the earlier 5.1-inch mount of the US Navy. The 51. The 5-inch 51, I mean. Not the 5.1. 51, 5-inch 51. Sorry. And, those guns, though, they are significantly older. And realistically, again, this is a good highlight for the fact that, in many ways, the Germans are, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, thanks to the greatly shrunken military that they have, thanks to the issues that have been pushed on them as a nation, thanks to the consequences of World War I, they are operating continually about a generation to a generation and a half behind other nations in their doctrine development of naval power. This is usually overshadowed by the fact that they are one of the nations which are pushing for things like blitzkrieg and other things with their aircraft, and there is stuff there as well when you consider the fact that whilst they are successfully pushing for it, they're not motorising the whole of their force because they can't. The British Army, barring a couple of yeomanry divisions which are reservist formations which are being upgraded at the beginning of World War II, have pretty much transferred themselves, created the entire force around being motorised, have motorised the entire force. There are some horse units, pack horse units, especially in the Indian Army, but that's for mountain warfare. But the point is, the Germans are always at the cutting edge in theory, but in the practice of what they're deploying are often still stuck that generation and a half behind. You can have great minds, you just can't deploy it. And in this case, the 127mm gun, what can I say about it? Well, its mounts are certainly behind the times. And the same point as the Royal Navy and pretty much every other navy, The US Navy has, of course, got the 5-inch 38, which Georgia just discussed, has an absolutely supreme mount, which really does give it great flexibility. They are implementing mounts which are manually controlled, capable of doing 40 degrees at best in their best form, and that's their 1938 form. Their 1934 form can do 30 degrees. And it's just not a good system. It's really not. When you consider what they are pushing for, what they need, this is not going to help them. It doesn't give them the rate of fire they need. It really doesn't. The one thing they do have is they can in theory train 360 degrees, or as far as their positioning on the hull allows them to. And as you can see from this design, that's not going to be a lot. None of those guns are doing 360 degrees. Then we have the Japanese. Now, the Japanese love their 127mm guns, their 5-inch guns, and honestly, they fall in love with the 127mm gun about the same time the British fall in love with the 4.7-inch, and it's for remarkably similar reasons, which, when you consider the average height and build of Japanese sailors in this time period versus the average height and build of British sailors at this time, really does make an interesting juxtaposition. But basically, it depends on what you're looking for. And again, one of the interesting things about the Japanese, if we consider them through World War II and the interwar years prior to that, is they remain remarkably consistently doctrinally. Their overall strategic doctrine stays remarkably similar for all those years as a guiding light. Whereas for the British and the Americans, both their doctrine and their strategy evolve. The Japanese are constantly looking at attrition warfare. They are constantly looking at doing operations getting closer and closer to Japan. They're constantly looking at these sort of style of scenarios. And again, you have it affecting their weapons and their weapon systems. When we start talking about these guns, again, the mount and the turrets make a difference. A Type 89 can do between -7 and +90, but there are variations on the mount which can do probably -8 to +85 degrees. It depends exactly on the phrasing of the system. Bow and stern mounts could tend to be -150 to +150. Midships mounts tended to be -70 to +70. Or rather, they could do 70 degrees on the negative and 70 degrees on the positive. But they're interesting systems. They really are. And their rate of fire, well, that was also particularly intriguing, because the Type 89 could apparently do 14 rounds per minute initially, but 8 rounds per minute sustained. So basically, they have an initial stockpile of rounds, but when it comes to them actually firing, once they've got their system, it's the supply chain which slows down their rate of fire. I don't actually believe the 14 rounds per minute. I think you can do it on land with a very well trained crew under stable conditions. I don't think there's any scenario at sea where you're going to achieve 14 rounds per minute with the way they are loaded and they are done. It just doesn't seem to me to be a high likelihood. It's one of those things which I can imagine being set there as a theory. Practice, it's not going to be the case. And these are the Type 88 and 89 we're talking about. The 88 was fitted primarily to submarines. I-5, I-6. The Type 89 was fitted to capital ships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, Matsu and Tachibana L-class escorts. The thing is about these guns, they're really useful in terms of teaching the Japanese what they want. And for attrition warfare, you have to remember again, what they want to do is rapid attacks in. They want to do long-range torpedo hits. They want to be able to cut up their enemy to take out their escorts as quickly as possible so they can whittle them down. The whole point of attrition conflict is to whittle down your opponent till you can beat them. People think the Japanese are just looking for Kantai-Kessen, decisive battle. That is part of their doctrine. It is not their whole doctrine. It is very much the end point of their doctrine after they've whittled you down, after they've attrited you at various points. I've done videos discussing this on this channel. Now the point is here. This builds up to what is the third year type Model 1914. The 5-inch or 127mm 50. And that's fitted to the Fubuki, Aniami, Akatsuki, Hachishura, Shiratsuru, Suryu, Asayo, Kagero, Yugumo, and Shimakaze classes, as well as the Shidori class torpedo boat. It's designed in 1926, it's in service from 1928, and its twin A mounts could do 5 rounds per minute per gun. Other variations on the twin mounts could achieve between 5 and 10 rounds per minute per gun. And again, it's a useful system, but again, this is definitely not. Whereas the earlier one is far more of an AA dual-purpose weaponry. This one, the Type B2 mounts, and the Type D mount, Type Bs and Type D mounts can get up to plus 75 degrees, which is decent. The single mounts, Type A single mount could get up to 75 degrees, but most of the single mounts are limited to 55 degrees, and it's about even Stevens. The Type A and the B3 and the C are all of the twin mounts are all limited to plus 55 degrees. Now, the thing is, these different mounts are for different reasons. You know, they're different weights to fit on a vessel. They're different weights to, give yourself advantages. And to be honest, their differences reflect, and their selection reflects, the differing perspectives on the risk of air attack, on what they think they're going to be doing in their operations, how they think they're going to be behaving over time. They are always thinking about the attrition warfare, and at 75 degrees, the rounds could achieve 40,000 feet, or 12 kilometers up. Not with necessarily great accuracy, which is one of the reasons why they have the issues, because they don't really have the target systems to support them, but they can get there. The fact is, these weapons could have been, for the Japanese, if they'd been properly invested in and properly supported, would have been a very useful system to have had going around a large amount of the fleet. A large amount of the fleet. And this, of course, picture is Fubuki, which is one of the special destroyers. Part of the special program. This was after she'd had her reinforcement work in 1936, because, the main trouble for the Japanese when firing their guns was the fact that, and this is another thing which affects the performance of the guns overall, the actual hull and the way it had been built and how strong it was. You see, British hulls are overbuilt in this period. German hulls are over-engineered. British hulls are overbuilt. There's a slight difference in that. Italian hulls are designed for speed. American hulls are designed, broadly speaking, for seaworthiness after the experience of the flush deck destroyers. They were really going for seaworthiness. Japanese hulls were designed to be light in the interwar period to try and get the maximum they could under the tonnage they were allowed. French hulls were again designed for speed, but were also often to an extent over-engineered. And this affects the characteristics of the gun performance, because you see, if your hull is lighter, it's going to less be able to deal with the persistent firing of the gun, especially at various angles, and if you take damage on the way underwater, it's more likely to cause you have your deck move under you and warp, and that can cause you issues with firing. That can cause you issues with accuracy and gun control and gun stability. So what do you think can have a factor on you and into your service and your ability for the gun to perform? This was Not so much a factor to an extent for the Japanese, because they tended to lose their ships if they got enough damage, but for some of them it was a decisive factor during that damage. Then we're up to the 130mm guns. When you're having to be extra special, and because you're French, mostly. The French really do get the biscuit for the most interesting gun calibers in this video. Now, the French have a love of, well, big guns. In fact, in this period, their motto would have been, "We love big guns and we cannot lie. We will never deny. We love big guns, we love big guns, we love big guns." I think they're possibly compensating for the fact that their battleship guns were usually smaller than everyone else's, but we'll leave that to one side. They love big guns on their destroyers. Now this creates many interesting issues, and the 130mm, believe it or not, is the entry level. The 5.1 inch is the entry level. Just wait until we get on to the 18-pounder, aka the 138.6mm. Just bear with me. It literally is the measurement from the 18-pounder. They are quite literally putting 18-pounders on their destroyers in the interwar years. That is how much of an impact the Royal Navy had on them in the Age of Sail. The French are still putting 18-pounders on things, thinking, "We need more to deal with the British. We need more! More 18-pounders! More!" But leave that to one side, okay? So the point is, for the French, as they're looking at their destroyers, and they're looking especially at the Mediterranean, they're looking at where they're going to operate in the world, they're thinking, we need to hit things hard. We don't have enough numbers, we don't have enough depth to our force, that if we don't hit it hard, we might not get another chance. First shot is what counts. First shot, first hit is what matters. And so they start looking at bigger guns than pretty much anyone else is really realistically looking at. I know there's not much difference between 5.1 inch and between 130mm and 127mm. There really isn't much difference. There are people who make a big thing over this difference. There isn't much. But it's a starting out point, and it does start to affect things. There's a reason why their rate of fire is usually 4 to 5 rounds a minute on the Model 1919. The Model 1924 gets up to 5 to 6 rounds a minute, and the Model 1935, which is similar to the Model 1932 that's fitted onto the Dunkirks, is 10 to 15 rounds per minute, depending on the training of the crew and the time. But the other issue with that one is that the Lahadi class carries 170 rounds per gun. The Dunkirk carried 400 rounds per gun. This is the other thing you find about the French. They do not carry a lot of ammunition per gun. In contrast, the Royal Navy's standard ship storage was about 300 rounds per gun. Usually 200 SAP, 50 rounds HE and 50 rounds Star Shell per gun. But this is what happens. This is the scenario you get. Now, the reason for this was because of the French desire for speed and desire for firepower, but they also don't necessarily think their ships are going to be operating a long way from supply and sustainment. Realistically, the French are the last to start thinking, hang on, what if our fleets are operating in the Far East? It's one of the really weird things when you look at them. They're talking about the Far East a lot, but it's one of the last place it hits in terms is their ship design and ship structuring, and thinking about logistics supply of sustaining forces out in the Far East. And there are reasons for this. There's also reasons of the issues they have in interwar years, but realistically they get focused on fighting the Mediterranean, they get focused on fighting on the Italians because of the treaty system, because of the way the treaty system works, and the fact that they are so focused in on the Italians. They can't not be focused in on the Italians. They're stuck next door to them and are stuck with parity in fleet. And this makes them think a lot more about Italian cruisers than probably they should do, which is another reason why they're going for the heavier guns, because they think this can land the fight up. And then you have the 138.6mm guns. Again, these are literally the 18-pounders. Literally, the 138.6mm is the millimeter size of an 18-pounder cannon. And this is the scenario you have for the French. They are pushing through these guns to give their ships extra firepower, extra capability. But, and I do mean a big but here, these guns, realistically, for them, do not necessarily deliver on that. If we consider the reality is that 1929 gets 12 rounds per minute maximum, 7 rounds per minute normally per gun. The model 1934 is 5 to 9 rounds per gun per minute per gun. In simple terms, that's not as good as many 6-inch guns. And the reason is because they are, from when you look at the size of the breach, you look at the space they take up, and you look at the various things, they are de facto 6-inch guns, but they are being put into a destroyer hull, which means you don't have the space in the turret that you do in a 6-inch turret. Literally, the rate of fire differential between these guns and a 6-inch gun is caused by the fact that you can actually fit physically more people around the gun. You can physically have more machinery, you have more space, you have more weight to allow for these things. These guns, on paper, look great. They look like they're going to give you a real edge. They do. But in reality, they don't. In reality, they give you a firepower, yes. But they don't give you the ability to really use that firepower. And that's when things get really problematic, because when we start to look through these guns and start to look at their capabilities and we go, okay, so how are they going to be employed? How will they be used? Well, the mounts from 1935, their maximum elevation is 30 degrees, plus 30 degrees. The same with the 1929 mounts. 35 mounts tend to support the 1934, 1934 R188, 36, etc. All the things, they support those. And they are a useful weapon, yes, but again, they also carry 100 rounds per gun. 100 rounds per gun. So you don't have many rounds, you don't have that great a rate of fire, they aren't truly dual purpose. All they are is you've managed to fit an 18-pounder. Admittedly, it's an 18-pounder that now fires, well, now fires an 88-pounder for many of its rounds. But still, you've got an 18-pounder cannon, gun, and realistically, if they had done a class of small light cruisers, they'd use their tonnage and churned out a class of small light cruisers based around this gun, I think I could have forgiven them more. And honestly, the space you could have had there on the tonnage variations, especially once you're getting into the post-London Treaty era, you could have designed something really chef's kiss good, and could have probably made those a truly dual-purpose mount. And the French would have had something which was truly world-leading and effective as a general-purpose AA cruiser slash rapid surface action cruiser. A picket ship for dealing with all the various threats which can come in. That's what you would have had. But they didn't get that. What they got was a large destroyer which was supposed to go and fight cruisers, but couldn't maintain a rate of fire equivalent to those cruisers, and couldn't realistically, despite things like a firing clock and all sorts of things to allow them to coordinate with our destroyers and try and get their firing to work together, couldn't make it all work. They really couldn't. But still, they're not the biggest guns, and those are, well, these. The fact is, someone thought, well, let's actually try putting near enough 6s, and it makes no difference, 6-inch guns, 150mm guns on destroyers, and let's see how that works, because we know that's going to be great, because that's going to give them a guaranteed kill ratio against destroyers, isn't it? It's going to be guaranteed kill ratio. Now, believe it or not, this is not just the Germans looking at the French and going, halt mein Bier. It's not just that. They actually, during World War One, the S-113s, V-16, G-19s, and B-112s, and some U-boat classes also carried a 150mm gun, 15cm 45, 5.9 inch, and yeah, these guns, some of them were still around and still in service, but they're not on ships. They're not on ships, and these weapons, well, how do I put this, had impressed the French so much that they actually did model them, use their breeches as a model for their 1927 model of the 138.6mm gun. But why are the Germans going for this? Why are the Germans returning back to these big guns? Well, honestly, they designed them in 1936. They're in service dates 1939 and 1942, depending on which one we're talking about, the 36 or the 36T. They could fire between 7 and 8 rounds a minute. It was a very powerful gun to have, and it certainly did make them fit into trying to fill in for their lack of light cruisers. But just because you have a 150mm gun on your ship does not make it a light cruiser. It really doesn't. And realistically, these guns got them into a lot of trouble. It got them into trouble because whilst they carried a twin mount forward, this mount forward caused their bows to get very wet. Again, they weren't really structurally designed for it. Again, one of the problems you have here is a constant worry which, to be honest, the British, the French, the Italians, the Germans are all wrestling with. The large destroyer / small cruiser issue. The Italians and the British both go with keeping to destroyer weaponry, but building building variations on a bigger destroyer. The British one is the Tribal class, which is, as I've explained in other videos, it even goes so far as to not having a continuous line of portholes. The portholes disappear in the middle of the ship as if it has an armor belt, making it look more cruiser-like from a distance, especially at night. That's because they need them to fill in the roles. But for the British, it's diplomatic terms they're really filling in, and in reconnaissance terms. For the French and Italians, it's to do with their fight in the Mediterranean. For the Germans, to make up their lack of numbers. It is to make up their lack of force strength. And they're realistically going, okay, we want some ships which can be dedicated destroyer killers, but also fit in the light cruiser profile and maybe allow us to box with enemy light cruisers. And you can't really do that, because you have put 6-inch guns, de facto, 6-inch guns de facto on these ships, and they are not, in simple terms, because they are still destroyers, because they are still very much built around a destroyer hull and destroyer stability profile, your rate of fire is not 7 to 8 rounds per minute per gun. It just isn't. Usually it's far lower than that, because the stability impacts them. And when they're trying again for air defense, for their operational, for their fire, these things are limited. The elevation of twin mount is plus 65 degrees, which you can see here, which is okay. The single mount is plus 30. Plus 30. So whilst the twin mount does have a chance, I would argue, in terms of its AA defense, a chance. It's not exactly high angle, but it's high enough. It's going to provide you a pretty convincing air defense profile and dual purpose weaponry. The others don't. They really don't. And their rate of fire also sees them mostly knocked out from that scenario. Same with the ammunition stowage. Per gun, it's 120 rounds per gun. That's not enough. That's not enough for what they need to do. It just isn't. But again, these ships are being built within a certain criteria, a certain modus operandi, and I would argue that in some regards that operandi is wrong. it's very much still in that the primary threat they have to deal with is surface threat. That the primary threat they're going to have to deal with is going to be ships bigger than them. And the effect the treaties had reduced the number of ships bigger than them. And realistically, any war you find yourself fighting in, like World War II, the moment you get into a major war, what are you going to get ready in time? What are you going to manage to build in time? You might finish off some large ships when you start constructing, but let's be honest, a destroyer takes 18 months to build and commission. A cruiser takes 2.5 years to build and commission. A capital ship is roughly the same, going to require a lot more resources. The same with a carrier. And there are more yards that can build destroyers, so what's the likely thing that's going to surge up in terms of numbers? It's going to be the destroyers. So your likely threat you're going to be fighting more often than not is destroyers. And this was the problem for the Germans. They built ships which were theoretically designed to kill other destroyers in a long-range duel, in a fight where they have space. And destroyer fights weren't like that. Destroyer fights were close and nasty. Look at them throughout World War II. They're not long-range standoff engagements, they're charging into each other. They are dogfights on the sea. They are close and they are nasty. Narvik is a classic example of this, but there are many others you can pick out. Many others you can focus on. And there are many reasons for this. One of them is the fact that destroyers, despite having these guns, have usually the lowest profile and the lowest ability to see their opponents. Then you add in any sea state which includes a significant motion up and down, and suddenly there are going to be times when they're going to be below the waves and can't even see their opponents because of that. So there are a lot of reasons why destroyers end up having such close-in fights. And a 6-inch gun works for a light cruiser with a stability profile and size of a light cruiser, which is able to carry out sustained fire and also carry enough of these to inflict sustained fire. But the thing is, what the Germans were building for was their shortage. Their shortage was, we don't have enough of these. It's like their torpedo boats. They're basically small destroyers. And then, of course, they have the Schnellboots, etc. Which are below that, which are true torpedo boats. But realistically, the torpedo boats, the oceanic torpedo boats, whatever they want to call them, they are not destroyers. There may be escort destroyers, you can miss around that argument, sloops, corvettes, that sort of category. But the thing is, they're supposed to be, as far as the Germans are concerned, able to match in with destroyers. And these are supposed to match in with light cruisers because they are having to build up as quickly as they can a capability that can, on paper, do the fighting it needs to do. And they can't. In fact, they'd probably been better if they put the money into developing a truly dual-purpose version of the 127mm gun. A truly dual-purpose mount. You know, if you consider this mount here, if you are putting in a smaller gun, but you have the same turret space, you'd be amazed at how much that can probably improve its angle of elevation and also its rate of fire. And realistically, that's what the Germans need. The Germans need something which allows their ships to be truly dual-purpose. But they didn't get that. They focused on the great specialists. The great specialists. So that all being said, and with Zebedee now woofing loudly from the bathroom apparently. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but he's literally behind that wall, which is a bathroom, and he's in there woofing. He might have jumped into the bath again. He's a lovely corgi, but that's why I'm telling you about the woofing, because he's now developed a new trick of jumping into the bath. Unfortunately, he hasn't yet figured out how to jump out of the bath. We're not quite sure why. Possibly because he likes the cuddles when he gets picked out of them. But leaving that to one side. I always finish these videos with a question, and I'm going to finish this one. And then I'm going to go off and cuddle a corgi, and we're all removing him from a bath, it sounds like. With all these guns being developed for destroyers, and all these systems going through, and the differences that there are in the destroyer designs. I would say, again, quite a lot of differences, especially between the American, the British, and the Japanese, come about because of treaty limitations. I.e., they don't want to break the treaties. Well, how to put this? They don't want to obviously break the treaties. They want to have something which is capable, but which slips under the radar. So let's say this. Let's say every power gets their best gun, Lord help you the French, and gets a fully dual-purpose mount. So it's able to do up to 85 degrees angle elevation, and it's got fully power-assisted loading, all those systems. So that they can do that full firing at any angle and loading at any angle. How do you think that changes World War II if everyone's on that standard? If everyone has, for coin of a better phrase, got the 5-inch 38 system. Not 5-inch 38, they've all got their own variations on that, their own guns, but have got the system equivalent to the system behind it. How do you think that changes World War II? That being said, what have we got coming up next? Next we've got... Well, this goes out on the Saturday in September. So it's the Battle of Cadiz, going godly for gold. It's always good to go godly for gold. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Toodles. And if you liked the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Thank you.